That night was especially cold and silent, as if the world around us had stopped to listen to what was about to happen. The raindrops gently tapped against the windows, creating a rhythmic sound that seemed to echo the weight of the words he had just heard. I, Emily, was standing in the middle of the living room, holding my son, Lucas, in my arms. The environment was shrouded in gloom that amplified the atmosphere of tension and despair. Every beat of my heart seemed louder than the murmur of the storm outside. John, my husband, was standing in front of me. The expression on his face was one of pure fury. His normally calm eyes were now filled with an anger I had never seen before. They shined like sharp blades, cutting deep into my soul with their contempt. The room, which used to be a haven of warmth and safety, now felt cold and hostile, a reflection of the coldness emanating from John. "Get rid of that child, Emily," he said in an icy voice that left no room for argument. His intonation was clipped, devoid of any trace of love or compassion. "He's not my son, and I don't want to see him in my house." His words resonated in the empty room, reverberating like a dark echo that seemed to penetrate every fiber of my being. I felt a chill run down my spine, each syllable filled with a rejection that crushed me inside. "John, please, he's just a baby," I begged, my voice shaking as I hugged Lucas to my chest. I could feel her warmth and her little heart beating against mine, tangible proof of her innocence and our connection. But John shook his head, his eyes fixed on me with a look of contempt that was almost unbearable. It seemed like every word I said only fueled his anger and rejection even more. "I don't want this child here. I don't want anything to remind me of his mistakes," he continued, his voice now raised, as if to make sure I understood the gravity of his rejection. The contempt in his tone was like acid, corroding any hope of reconciliation or understanding. Each word was a blow that made me recoil, feeling increasingly powerless and helpless. I could see the rigidity in his body, the way he held himself straight and unyielding, as if he were building an insurmountable barrier between us. His words were walls that excluded me from his life, leaving me outside, in the cold storm of rejection and contempt. It was as if he was determined to erase any trace of affection or connection that might still exist between us. As the rain continued to fall outside, each drop seeming to mark the rhythm of our disintegration, I realized this wasn't just an argument. It was an ultimatum, a line drawn in the sand that marked the end of something I thought was indestructible. The pain of John's rejection was unbearable, but even more painful was the thought that he wanted me to choose between him and my son, a choice I knew I could never make. With every cruel word that left his mouth, I felt the crushing weight of the decision that was before me. Lucas, in my arms, began to stir, perhaps sensing the growing tension between us. I looked at him, his innocent, peaceful face, and I knew that no matter what happened, I would do whatever was necessary to protect him. The battle raging in that room was not just a dispute between husband and wife, but a fight for a mother's soul and her child's future. I stood there, frozen in shock, as John turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing through the house like a drum announcing the end. He left me alone, wrapped in a thick cloud of pain and despair, with Lucas, our son, in my arms. The silence that followed his departure was almost deafening, filled only by the soft murmur of the rain tapping against the windows. Lucas, with his big, innocent eyes, looked at me without understanding the storm that was forming around us, his small body snuggled against mine. My mind was spinning with dark and confusing thoughts, trying to process what had just happened. The pain of John's words was like an open wound, bleeding slowly and steadily. However, along with the pain, a new emotion began to grow within me, a fierce determination to protect my son at any cost. I knew I couldn't allow John to continue to threaten our happiness and safety. No matter what it took, I would fight to keep Lucas safe. I hugged Lucas tighter, feeling the warmth of his body against mine, as if I was trying to create a protective shield between him and the cruel world John was trying to impose on us. He was just a baby, innocent and defenseless, and he deserved a future full of love and security. John, with his anger and rejection, didn't understand what it meant to be a mother. He didn't understand the unbreakable bond that existed between a mother and her child, a connection that transcends any error or imperfection. As I felt Lucas's heart beat against mine, an unwavering determination began to take hold of me. I knew I had to act, that I couldn't let John continue to dictate the rules of our lives. His presence in our home had become a constant threat, a dark reminder that he would never accept Lucas as part of our family. And that was something I couldn't and wouldn't accept. John was not just a man who had lost his way. He had become a shadow that obscured any hope of happiness I might have had with Lucas. He was the embodiment of all the fears and uncertainties I had about the future. However, looking at my son, I knew that no matter how difficult it was, I had to find a way to free us from that oppressive shadow. With each thought, the determination to protect my son solidified even more. I knew the road ahead would be full of challenges and pain, but I also knew I was not alone. I had Lucas, and he was my strength, my reason to fight. With each tear that fell, my resolve strengthened, as if each drop was cleansing me of the doubt and fear that John had planted in my heart. As the night wore on and the rain continued to fall outside, I decided I needed to take definitive action. I could no longer allow John to control our destiny. I needed to find a way to remove him from our lives and make sure Lucas had the safety and love he deserved. With renewed determination, I promised myself that I would do whatever it took to protect my son, even if it meant facing the darkest and most painful challenges life could throw at me. During the weeks following our confrontation, I tried with all my might to find a way to get John to accept Lucas. Each day was a silent battle, a desperate attempt to save what was left of our family. Sometimes he hoped that time and patience could melt the ice around John's heart, but every attempt at dialogue was met with a wall of silence or contempt. He became increasingly cold and distant. His presence at home became a shadow that hung over us, threatening and oppressive. I felt like a stranger in my own home, a place that had once been a sanctuary of love and security, now transformed into an emotional battlefield. The walls that were once witness to laughter and happy conversations now echoed the emptiness and tension that permeated each room. John avoided any contact with Lucas. His indifference was like a poison that seeped into every aspect of our daily lives. He moved further and further away, leaving me alone to deal with the responsibilities and challenges of being a mother. Every time I tried to talk to John about Luke, about the future, or about the need to find a way forward, his response was either a deafening silence or a look of contempt that cut deeper than any words. "You still don't understand, Emily," he said, his tone thick with coldness. "This baby is not part of my life and never will be." His words were like knives, ripping away any hope I had of reconciliation. Lucas, in his innocence, did not understand the darkness that fell on our house. Their bright eyes and carefree smiles were a ray of light in the darkness that threatened to engulf us. I tried to maintain normality. I tried to protect Lucas from his own father's rejection, but with each passing day, the task became more difficult. I felt increasingly alone and helpless, a mother struggling to maintain her sanity in the midst of chaos. Loneliness was a constant companion, a presence that embraced me at night as John moved away to the other side of the bed, creating a gulf between us. I lay down, looking at the ceiling, trying to find a solution, but the darkness seemed to swallow up any glimmer of hope. Desperation began to settle in my heart, a shadow that spread slowly and inexorably. However, even in the midst of this darkness, I knew I couldn't give up. Lucas needed me. He needed someone who loved him unconditionally and protected him from the cruel world that was forming around us. I knew that no matter how hard it was, I needed to find a way to ensure her safety and happiness. John had become a danger, a threat that needed to be faced. It was then that, on a sleepless night, the idea of a desperate plan began to form in my mind. I couldn't continue living in that hell. I couldn't allow John to continue to oppress us with his rejection and indifference. I needed to find a way to free us, to make sure Lucas had a chance to grow up in a safe, loving environment. And with that thought, I began to plan our escape, a path away from the darkness that threatened to consume us. It was then that I realized I needed to take action. I couldn't allow John's presence to continue to poison our lives. I needed to find a way to protect Lucas and ensure he had a happy and safe childhood. I decided it was time to confront John in a way he would never forget. That night, after putting Lucas to sleep, the air in our house felt like it was charged with electricity, the tension almost palpable. The shadows cast by the street lamps danced across the walls of the living room, creating an ambience that seemed a dark omen of what was to come. The silence was broken only by the incessant ticking of the clock on the wall, marking time that seemed to drag by, each second bringing me closer to the inevitable confrontation with John. I was sitting on the couch, my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing the firm decision I had made. When I heard the key turn in the lock and the door open, my entire body tensed. John entered, his expression marked by tiredness and irritation. He didn't seem to realize the gravity of the situation, or perhaps he chose to ignore it. His presence was like a dark shadow that seemed to stretch across the room, suffocating any trace of hope that might still remain. He dropped his bag on the floor with a sudden movement and looked at me, a mixture of impatience and contempt in his eyes. "John, we need to talk," I said. My voice was firm, but I could feel the tension running through it. I got up from the couch and took a step towards him, looking directly at him, trying to find any trace of the man I had loved. But his eyes were cold, filled with an impatience that cut like a sharp blade. "We have nothing to talk about, Emily," he replied, his voice dripping with contempt. "You know my stance on this, child." He turned away, as if he had had enough of the conversation before it even began, as if every word was a weight he didn't want to carry. His disdain was a barrier he erected between us, a wall of coldness that seemed insurmountable. "Lucas is my son, John, and I will never abandon him," I said, my voice shaking with the strength of the emotion I tried to control. I knew I was on the verge of a decision that would change our lives forever, but I also knew I could no longer live in that oppressive shadow. "If you can't accept it, then maybe you'd better leave." My words were like an ultimatum, a final point that I knew I could no longer avoid. John stopped, his hand still gripping the door handle, and slowly turned to face me. His eyes were filled with a silent fury, a fire that seemed ready to consume everything around him. "Do you really think you can send me away, Emily? This is my home. If anyone should leave, it's you and this bastard." His words were poison, each syllable dripping with the bitterness of someone who felt betrayed and stripped of control. "No, John, we're not going anywhere," I replied, my voice now firm and resolute. "You can choose to leave, or learn to live with the fact that Lucas is part of our family. But I will no longer allow you to treat us like this." I felt a wave of courage and determination wash over me, a strength that I knew I had to sustain no matter what happened next. He took a step toward me, his eyes wide with disbelief and anger that seemed to grow by the second. "You're making a huge mistake, Emily. You're not going to challenge me in my own home." His voice was louder now, a scream that echoed through the empty room, filling the space with an almost unbearable tension. "Maybe it's you who's making a mistake, John," I replied, feeling my body shake with the adrenaline and fear that mixed in my veins. "Maybe it's you who doesn't understand what it means to be a family. And if that's something you can't accept, then there's no place for you here." Every word was a challenge, a declaration that I was willing to fight for Lucas, no matter the cost. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, a battlefield where every word was a weapon, every look a shot fired in a silent war. I knew that the decisive moment had arrived, and that whatever John decided, our lives would never be the same. John let out a bitter laugh, a sound that reverberated through the room like thunder in a stormy sky. "Do you really think you can send me away, Emily? This is my home, and I'm not going anywhere," he said, voice dripping with disdain. "If anyone should leave, it's you and that bastard." His words were like daggers, each piercing deeply into my heart and leaving an open wound that burned with the pain of rejection. His words hit me like a knife, but instead of knocking me down, they strengthened my resolve. The anger and contempt in his voice only served to ignite a flame within me, a flame that burned with the need to protect my son at any cost. Lucas was innocent, and I knew I couldn't allow John to continue to poison our lives with his cruelty and bitterness. I stared at John, my vision blurring for a moment with the intensity of the emotions churning within me. "Then you leave me no choice, John," he said, taking a firm step towards him. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins, each beat of my heart like a war drum, echoing the decision I knew I needed to make. "I will do whatever is necessary to protect my son." My voice was firm, but it carried a weight that I knew he couldn't ignore. John took a step back, surprised by my sudden firmness. His eyes narrowed, filled with anger and disbelief. "You're bluffing, Emily. You don't have the courage to do what you're suggesting," he said, but there was a hesitation in his voice, an uncertainty that gave me a glimmer of hope. He didn't expect me to be able to oppose him so resolutely. "I'm not bluffing, John," I replied, keeping my gaze fixed on his. "I will not allow you to continue to control us and destroy our happiness. If you cannot accept Lucas, then there is no place for you in our lives." The words fell from my lips with a clarity that surprised even myself. It was as if, for the first time, I was seeing with absolute clarity what needed to be done. The tension in the room was palpable, a thread about to snap. John stood before me, a mixture of anger and confusion on his face. "You can't do this to me, Emily. I'm your husband. This is my house," he shouted. But his words seemed to lose force as the certainty in my voice began to penetrate his facade of self-confidence. "This house isn't a home anymore, John," I replied, my voice calm and steady. "It's a battlefield, and I won't let you continue to hurt us. Lucas deserves better than this, and so do I." Each word was a step toward my freedom, a declaration that I was no longer willing to live under the yoke of John's cruelty and contempt. He looked at me, his gaze filled with helpless fury. "You're going to regret this, Emily," he hissed, but I could see the fear beginning to form in his eyes. He was beginning to realize that I was serious, that my determination was unwavering. And with that, the dynamic between us began to change. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that the fight was just beginning. But I also knew I was willing to do anything to ensure my son's safety and happiness. John had shown his cards, and now it was my turn to act. And with that decision firmly engraved in my heart, I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that in the end, Lucas' love and protection were the only things that truly mattered. In the days following our confrontation, the tension in our home only increased. The atmosphere was suffocating, every silence filled with unspoken threats, every look filled with distrust and repressed anger. John began exhibiting increasingly aggressive and erratic behavior. The nights he spent away from home, returning late and altered, became more and more frequent. I could see the darkness creeping into his gaze, an omen that something terrible was about to happen. With each passing day, I felt the urgency to act, to protect Lucas and myself from the growing danger. That fateful night, as I put Lucas to sleep, I felt an unusual uneasiness. There was something in the air, a sense of imminence that made me look nervously at the clock. Time seemed to drag by, and the wait was almost unbearable. Finally, I heard the front door open with a bang. John entered the room, his eyes glassy and his face contorted into a mask of rage. He was visibly altered, perhaps under the influence of alcohol or drugs. His movements were uncoordinated and his breath was permeated with a strong, nauseating smell. "No more games, Emily. I'm fed up with this situation. Tomorrow, you and that kid are leaving," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty, gloomy room. The fury in his tone was almost palpable, like a storm about to explode. I felt my heart speed up, each beat reverberating in my ears like a war drum. I knew that this was the decisive moment, the moment when everything would change forever. "No, John. I'm not leaving here and abandoning our life," I shouted back, adrenaline pumping through my veins, giving me desperate courage. The words came out of my mouth with a force that surprised even myself. I was tired of living in fear, tired of being overwhelmed by John's anger and violence. Lucas needed a safe home, and I was determined to fight for it. John approached me, his eyes shining with pure, unrelenting hatred. "Don't you understand, Emily? I want you guys out of here." His voice was a roar, each word a burst of rage that made me flinch. I felt a chill running down my spine, a dark feeling that things were about to take a tragic turn. Every fiber of my being screamed for protection, for safety, but there was nowhere to run. There was no escape. And then, in an act of desperation and brutality that I never thought he was capable of, John raised his hand to strike me. The violence in his gesture was a shock to the system, a clear sign that he was beyond reason, beyond any possibility of redemption. My world shrank to a point of absolute terror, where every second seemed to stretch into an eternity of fear and impending pain. I backed away, instinctively raising my arms to protect myself, but the blow came with relentless force, hitting me in the face and knocking me against the wall. Pain exploded in my head, a flash of white light that left me momentarily stunned. I heard the muffled sound of Lucas crying in the next room, his voice desperate and helpless in the face of the violence that was happening. I knew I needed to do something. I needed to protect my son from that storm of hate that threatened to destroy our lives. With strength I didn't know I had, I stood up, my face throbbing with pain, but my heart firm in the decision that I wouldn't allow John to hurt us anymore. "That's enough, John. I won't allow you to hurt us anymore," I shouted, my voice echoing with fierce determination. The look of surprise on his face was all I needed to understand that he hadn't expected resistance, hadn't expected me to fight back. The fight that followed was swift and brutal, a confusion of movements and screams that ended with John lying on the ground, his body finally overwhelmed by the violence he had cultivated so much. The feeling of triumph was bittersweet, a victory that came at the cost of the peace and security I so desired. I knew that our life would never be the same, that tragic moment would forever mark our existence. As the night unfolded in heavy silence, I felt the gravity of what had happened. John was lying on the ground, his life draining away amidst the blood and violence he himself had sown. And I, with Lucas in my arms, knew that, despite everything, I had done what I needed to do to protect my son. Darkness still enveloped our home, but there was a small flame of hope, a promise of a future where light would finally prevail over the shadow. In an instinctive impulse of self-preservation, I grabbed the vase of flowers that was on the table next to me and, with a quick and desperate movement, threw it at John. The vase, a wedding gift, now transformed into a defensive weapon, flew through the air and crashed into his shoulder. The impact caused the vase to shatter into 1,000 fragments, which scattered across the floor like crystallized tears. John, taken by surprise, stumbled backwards, a mixture of shock and fury on his face. "Are you crazy, Emily?" he shouted, his voice resounding through the room. "This is over once and for all. I'm going to end you and this child." His words, carrying a deadly threat, were like an alarm bell that reverberated in my mind. I knew there was no more time for hesitation or doubt. The look in his eyes was one of pure hatred, turning him into someone I barely recognized. He lunged at me with a strength that made me realize I was willing to do anything to protect my son's life and my own. The deafening noise of screams and confusion echoed through the house, reaching the room where Lucas slept. The loud, sudden sound made him wake up and start crying, a wail that pierced the chaos and went straight to my heart, strengthening my resolve. That small voice, full of fear and confusion, was the strength I needed to keep fighting. I knew I couldn't fail him. I couldn't let John hurt him. I freed myself from John with a desperate push and ran towards the kitchen, my mind working at high speed, looking for a quick solution. I knew I needed something to defend myself, something I could use to keep John at bay. I grabbed a knife from the knife block on the counter, feeling the cold, familiar weight of the metal in my shaking hands. The blade gleamed in the dim light, a symbol of my last hope for protection. John entered the kitchen right behind me, his breathing heavy and his eyes blazing with fury. His every step felt like a war drum, marking the rhythm of an inevitable confrontation. He advanced with a look of wild determination, the muscles in his body tense with the intention of subduing me. But I was no longer willing to be the victim. I raised the knife, my hand shaking with the mix of fear and adrenaline. "Don't come any closer, John," I shouted, my voice echoing with an intensity one didn't know it had. "Don't make me do this." My words were a desperate plea, a last attempt to stop the violence that threatened to consume us. I could see the surprise in his eyes, a spark of doubt that ignited amid the anger. But John didn't stop. His face contorted into a mask of rage and despair. He continued to advance, defying my resolve. His every step felt heavier, more determined, and I knew I was about to face the biggest battle of my life. The knife shook in my hand, but my resolve didn't waver. I was ready to do whatever it took to protect Lucas, to make sure he had the chance to live a life free from fear and violence. As John approached, a strange calm came over me. I knew that the decision I would make in the next few seconds would change our lives forever. Every move, every choice, was a reflection of my determination to fight for my son's safety and future. And so, with my heart pounding and my mind clear, I prepared to face the approaching storm, knowing that there was no turning back, that this was the last chance to guarantee our freedom and our peace. John didn't stop. His eyes were fixed on the knife I held in trembling hands, but he was blinded by hate and anger, a darkness that seemed to have consumed every part of his humanity. "Do you really think you can stop me from this, Emily? You're weak, always have been," he screamed, his voice reverberating off the kitchen walls like an echo of torment. Every word was a blow to my resolve, a desperate attempt to break me. With a roar of fury, he lunged at me, his intent clear and deadly. It all happened in an instant, but to me, time seemed to slow down, each second dragging by like I was trapped in a vortex of despair. The look in his eyes, a mixture of contempt and arrogance, was etched in my mind. However, my determination to protect my son was stronger than the fear he tried to instill in me. In a reflex act of self-defense, I thrust the knife forward. The movement was rapid, driven by the desperate need to survive. The shining blade found its target with cold precision, piercing flesh and tissue with a resistance that seemed almost surreal. The sound of metal penetrating his body was muffled, a dark soundtrack to the inevitable end unfolding before me. Time seemed to freeze as the blade penetrated his abdomen. I could feel the knife shake in my hands, the impact reverberating through my bones. John stopped, his eyes wide with shock and pain, as if the reality of the situation was just beginning to sink in his mind. The expression on his face quickly changed from anger to surprise and finally to disbelief. It was as if he couldn't believe that I, Emily, the woman he had always considered weak, had done something so definitive. He looked at me, his eyes now filled with sharp pain, a silent plea for understanding that was impossible to ignore. His mouth opened, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Only a faint, gurgling sound escaped his lips, the life beginning to drain from him with each passing second. His hand came up shakily, trying to reach the blade embedded in his abdomen, but his movements were slow and uncoordinated, as if his body was already giving up the fight. Before I could fully process what had happened, John fell to the ground with a thud, his life quickly draining away in a pool of blood that spread with frightening rapidity. The scarlet liquid stained the kitchen floor, a silent testament to the violence that had just occurred. I dropped the knife, and it fell to the floor with a metallic clang, the sound echoing in my mind like a bell of doom. I knelt down beside John, my entire body shaking with the adrenaline and horror of what I had just done. He looked at me with glassy eyes, one last flicker of life slowly fading away. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a last breath of a lost soul. And then, he stopped breathing, his body relaxing into a final stillness. The silence that followed was crushing, every second an eternity of guilt and grief. John's blood continued to spread, a growing stain that seemed to swallow everything around it. I knew there was no other option, that I had done what was necessary to protect my son, but the weight of reality was almost unbearable. I stood up slowly, my movements automatic, as if I were in a dream I couldn't wake up from. John's life was over, and with it, the threat he posed to me and Lucas. However, the price I paid was high, a burden I would have to carry for the rest of my life. I looked at John's still body, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness, knowing that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. I stood there, frozen in shock, unable to fully process the magnitude of what had just happened. John's limp body lay on the kitchen floor, a pool of blood rapidly spreading around him, dyeing the floor a deep, disturbing red. The air felt heavy, filled with an oppressive silence that suffocated my thoughts and emotions. My body shook uncontrollably, and the world around me seemed to spin in slow motion, as if I were trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. It was the sound of Lucas's desperate crying in the next room that brought me back to reality, pulling me from the abyss of days into which I had fallen. With an instinctive movement, I released the knife that I was still holding with trembling hands. The blood-stained blade fell to the ground with a dull, metallic sound. The impact resonated through the kitchen, breaking the silence almost deafeningly. The sight of blood spreading across the blade and floor was a brutal reminder of the violence that had just occurred. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, but I forced myself to ignore it. My priority now was Lucas. I got up quickly, almost tripping in my own haste, and ran to the room where he was. The sound of her crying was a desperate call that echoed through the hallway, each wail a plea for her mother's presence and comfort. "Sure, it's okay, my love, it's okay," I whispered, trying to calm him and, at the same time, calm the storm raging inside me. I picked him up, feeling the warmth of his small body against mine, his heart beating fast in a frantic rhythm. Her tears soaked my blouse, and I felt the urgency to give her a sense of security that, at that moment, seemed so distant. The familiar scent of her hair brought me a brief moment of solace, a reminder that despite everything, there was something pure and innocent worth fighting for. With my voice still shaking, I managed to dial the emergency number. Each ringtone seemed like an eternity, each second an extension of the terror that still hung in the air. When I was finally answered, my voice was low and broken. "Please come quickly, it was self-defense. He was going to kill us," I explained, trying to remain calm as I described the situation concisely and desperately. The woman on the other end of the line sounded calm, her words a thread of safety amidst the chaos. "We are on our way, ma'am. Please stay safe and wait for the police and ambulance to arrive." As I waited for the police and ambulance to arrive, I sat on the kitchen floor, hugging Lucas tightly, as if his presence could anchor me amid the whirlwind of emotions that were sweeping through me. My heart was beating wildly, a cacophony of fear, relief, and sadness. John's body, still motionless, was a silent reminder of the tragic end of a relationship that should have been built on love and trust. I felt a mixture of shock and relief. The pain of having taken a life was in contrast to the certainty that I had done what was necessary to protect my son. Every breath was an effort to maintain sanity, to deal with the weight of the consequences that would soon come. That night, as I waited at the police station to give a statement, the hours dragged by in an oppressive silence, interrupted only by the occasional click of police officers' keyboards and the distant murmur of conversations. The environment was cold and sterile, a reflection of the emptiness I felt inside me. John was dead, and my life would never be the same. I had lost a husband, a relationship that had once been promising and full of dreams. The reality of that loss was crushing, but at the same time, I knew I had protected my son from a dark, pain-filled future. The duality of feelings was a heavy burden, a mixture of sadness and relief that I still struggled to process. As time passed, I began to reflect on every detail of what had happened, on the choices that led me to that moment. The image of John, lying on the kitchen floor, was a shadow that hung over me, a constant reminder of the consequences of our actions. I understood that every decision, every movement, has immense weight and that, sometimes, we are forced to take extreme measures to protect those we love. Lucas's life was now free from the constant threat that John posed, and as painful as it was, he knew he had done what was necessary. I realized that true strength lies not only in the ability to defend physically, but also in the courage to face the unknown and take control of our destiny, even when the path is uncertain and frightening. Facing John was a battle, not just against him, but against the fears and insecurities that haunted me. Every moment of doubt and despair taught me that courage is often a solitary choice, an act of faith in ourselves and our ability to overcome adversity. Lucas and I would start over, far from the shadows of the past and the threats that John brought into our lives. The vision of the future was uncertain, but also full of possibilities. I promised myself that I would do whatever was necessary to ensure he had a safe and happy life, free from the painful memories of what we had been through. Every day would be a new opportunity to build a home where he could grow in peace and security, surrounded by love and understanding. That promise was now the beacon that guided my actions, a commitment I was determined to keep. With this renewed determination, I was ready to face the future, knowing that at every step, my son's protection and well-being would be my absolute priority. The journey would be long and full of challenges, but I was prepared to face them with the same courage and strength that had sustained me until now. I knew that, regardless of the adversities that could still arise, Lucas would have a future where John's shadow could no longer reach us. And so, with a heavy heart but full of hope, I looked at the path ahead, ready to build a new life for both of us, a life where love and security would be the foundations of a new beginning.